The night sea is calm enough to deceive. Dark, flat, almost gentle, until the first concussion rips through the hull and turns silence into chaos. On the deck of the HMS Carmania, men stagger as if the world itself has been struck. A violent shudder runs through iron and bone alike. Somewhere below, metal screams as it tears. Somewhere above, a lookout grips the rail, knuckles white, eyes fixed on a shape emerging from the darkness. There is no warning shot. No heroic charge. Only confusion, fog, and the sudden understanding that the enemy is already too close. Oil smoke burns the throat. Steam hisses from ruptured pipes. The deck tilts just enough for boots to slip, for balance to fail. Orders are shouted, then shouted again, lost in the wind and the growing thunder of gunfire. A young sailor drops to one knee, palms pressed against the deck, feeling the vibration of engines still fighting, still pushing, even as the ship begins to suffer wounds it cannot hide. Below decks, lights flicker. A mug rolls across a table and shatters. A letter, half-written, slides from a bunk and disappears into shadow. Men glance at one another, searching faces for certainty that no one possesses. The smell of hot metal mixes with salt and smoke. Someone whispers a prayer without realizing it. Outside, the sea reflects muzzle flashes like broken stars. The Carmania answers with her own guns, each blast echoing across the water, each recoil shivering through her frame. She was never meant for this kind of war, not built for it, not armed for it, but tonight, history has demanded something else. And in the space between seconds, between impact and realization, lives are already being decided. Some men will survive this night carrying memories they will never escape. Others will be claimed quietly, without witness, swallowed by steel and sea. The world will move on. The records will thin. And the story of what truly happened aboard the HMS Carmania will begin to fade, unless we listen closely enough to hear it still breathing beneath the waves. Chapter 1: A Civilian Ship Thrown into War. The Carmania had once been a place of polished brass and quiet luxury, a ship built to cradle travelers across long miles of ocean with the promise of safety and routine. Even after her conversion, traces of that former life lingered, rounded stair rails worn smooth by thousands of hands, cabin doors that still carried the faint scent of varnish and soap. But war had a way of hollowing familiar things. It stripped comfort down to structure, reduced elegance to utility, and turned a passenger liner into something uneasy and alert. On the morning she sailed under a naval flag, the sea lay deceptively calm. The water was steel gray and flat, the horizon blurred by a thin haze that erased any clear sense of distance. Sailors moved across the deck with deliberate purpose, boots thudding softly against planks that no longer felt neutral beneath their feet. Each step carried weight now. Each sound seemed louder, sharper, as if the ship herself were listening. Men stood at the rail, watching the coastline recede until it dissolved into fog. Some said nothing at all. Others spoke too much, jokes delivered too quickly, laughter that died just as fast. A young signalman folded a letter and slid it into his jacket pocket, fingers lingering on the paper for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't reread it. He already knew every word by heart. Below decks, hammocks swayed gently with the motion of the sea. The smell of oil and fresh paint hung in the air, mingling with salt and damp wool. Guns, newly installed and unfamiliar, loomed where deck chairs once sat. Men passed them cautiously, glancing at the steel barrels as if unsure whether to trust them. These were not the tools they had trained with in peacetime drills. These were instruments meant to tear ships apart. The officers tried to project certainty. Orders were issued cleanly, efficiently. But even they felt the shift, the subtle tension of knowing that the Carmania was not a warship by nature. She was fast, yes. Strong enough, perhaps. But she carried no armor worthy of the sea's new violence. Her hull, built for speed and comfort, would not forgive mistakes. As the day wore on, watches rotated. The sea remained empty. Too empty. Lookouts strained their eyes, scanning the horizon until it ached. Fog thickened and thinned in slow, breathing waves, swallowing sound, distorting distance. A funnel coughed out smoke that flattened against the sky, leaving a bitter taste in the mouth of anyone downwind. In the late afternoon, a murmur passed along the deck. A shape, dark and angular, had been sighted through the haze. Men moved instinctively, hands finding rails, posts, the edges of gun mounts. Someone swallowed hard. Someone else crossed himself without thinking. The Carmania altered course slightly, engines pushing her forward with steady insistence. The vibration traveled up through the soles of boots, into calves, into chests. The ship felt alive beneath them, powerful, eager, unaware of what waited ahead. The shape grew clearer. Another vessel. Armed. Watching. Time stretched thin. Every second seemed suspended, heavy with unspoken questions. Was this an encounter or an ambush? A test or a death sentence? The men aboard the Carmania held their breath collectively, listening to the creak of rigging, the distant churn of water against steel. Then the first shot shattered the illusion of calm. The explosion cracked across the sea, violent and sudden, followed by the whine of metal tearing into flesh and structure. The deck jolted. A sailor stumbled, catching himself against a gun mount, eyes wide with shock. Smoke bloomed outward, thick and choking, carrying the acrid sting of cordite. Another blast followed, closer this time, sending splinters skittering across the deck like thrown knives. Orders erupted. Men ran. Guns answered with thunder, their recoil slamming back into trembling frames. The Carmania was no longer a ship in transition. She was a ship at war. Below, lights flickered. A cup shattered against the floor. A man braced himself against a bulkhead, feeling the vibration of battle pulse through the steel like a second heartbeat. The first moments of combat were confusion made physical. Sound overwhelmed thought. Smoke erased edges. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the men aboard the Carmania understood, this would not be a clean fight, nor a short one. The sea had accepted their challenge. And it would demand payment. Smoke rolled across the deck in thick, choking sheets, blurring the line between sky and sea until everything became a single shifting mass of gray. The Carmania lurched as another shell struck nearby, the concussion slamming through her frame and rattling teeth. Men staggered, boots skidding on planks slick with mist and soot. Someone shouted an order that dissolved before it reached the far end of the deck. The enemy ship emerged and vanished again in the fog, a dark presence revealed only by the flash of its guns. Each burst of light carved the silhouette of its hull into the air for a heartbeat, then erased it. The uncertainty gnawed at the men aboard the Carmania. They fired at shapes, at shadows, at the memory of where the ship had been seconds before. The sea reflected the flashes like shattered glass, turning the water into something violent and alive. A gun crew worked feverishly near the starboard rail. Their hands were blackened with soot, fingers trembling as they loaded and fired again. The metal of the gun barrel grew hot enough to sting through gloves. One man hissed as he burned his palm, shook his hand once, then went back to work without a word. Pain was a luxury they could not afford to acknowledge. Below decks, the air was worse. Smoke crept down corridors and into compartments, burning eyes and lungs. The smell of oil and heated metal pressed into the back of the throat, making every breath feel incomplete. A young sailor crouched beside a ruptured pipe, trying to stem the hiss of escaping steam with rags that did nothing but soak through instantly. His face glistened with sweat, eyes wide and glassy. When the pipe burst fully, he recoiled with a cry, hands flying to his face. Two men dragged him away, boots slipping as the ship shuddered again. Somewhere above, another explosion rattled the overhead beams, showering dust and rust flakes down like dirty snow. The Carmania groaned under the strain, a long, low sound that seemed to come from her very bones. On the bridge, officers shouted into speaking tubes, voices hoarse with urgency. Orders overlapped, collided, were repeated. Course adjustments were made by instinct now, guided by brief glimpses of the enemy through the fog. The ship surged forward, engines pounding steadily, determined to close distance even as shells screamed past. A shell struck closer this time. The impact threw a man from his feet, slamming him against a bulkhead with sickening force. He slid down, leaving a dark smear behind him. Another sailor dropped to his knees beside him, shouting his name, hands shaking as he tried to assess the damage. The wounded man's breath came in wet, uneven gasps. His eyes flickered, unfocused, searching for something to hold on to. "Stay with me," the sailor whispered, voice breaking. "Just stay." But the noise swallowed his plea. The battle raged on, indifferent to individual suffering. Above, the fog thickened again, turning the world into a claustrophobic blur. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The enemy ship's gunfire grew more erratic, flashes blooming at unexpected angles. The Carmania's crew adjusted instinctively, firing where they thought the ship must be, trusting muscle memory and training more than sight. A sudden jolt rocked the deck harder than before. The ship heeled sharply, throwing men sideways. Someone screamed. A crate broke loose and skidded across the deck, smashing into a railing with a splintering crack. For a moment, it felt as if the Carmania herself might give way under the violence inflicted upon her. Water seeped through a seam near the forward compartments, a thin, relentless trickle that pooled at the base of the bulkhead. A sailor noticed it and froze, staring at the dark line creeping along the floor. He called out, voice tight with fear, and another man rushed over. They pressed cloth against the leak, hands shaking, knowing even as they tried that the sea always found a way. The enemy's fire slackened briefly. An uneasy lull settled over the ship, broken only by the hiss of steam and the crackle of small fires being beaten out. Men took shallow breaths, listening, waiting. The fog shifted, revealing nothing, then everything. The opposing ship loomed suddenly off the port bow, closer than before, its guns blazing. The shock of its appearance tore a collective gasp from the crew. Orders rang out, sharp and desperate. The Carmania answered with a full broadside, the recoil shuddering through her frame like a violent heartbeat. The impact was devastating. Flames erupted along the enemy's deck, briefly illuminating figures scrambling amid smoke and debris. For a fleeting moment, triumph flickered, then vanished as another shell slammed into the Carmania, tearing into her superstructure with brutal force. The ship reeled. Men were thrown flat. Smoke surged anew, thicker than ever, swallowing sound and sight. Somewhere in the chaos, a man cried out for his mother. Another whispered a prayer so softly it was lost to the wind. The Carmania pressed on, battered and burning, her civilian heart forced into the rhythm of war. She had crossed a threshold now, past preparation, past illusion. There would be no turning back. Only endurance. Only consequence. The fog thinned just enough to reveal the damage, and then thickened again, as if ashamed to linger. The Carmania steamed forward through smoke and drifting debris, her once clean lines now scarred and blackened. Paint blistered along the superstructure. Shattered wood littered the deck. The smell of burned cordite and hot oil clung to everything, seeping into clothes, hair, skin, into memory. Men moved more slowly now. Not from hesitation, but from exhaustion that had already sunk deep into muscle and bone. Hands trembled as they reloaded guns. Voices came out hoarse, scraped raw by shouting over explosions. A sailor leaned briefly against a bulkhead, forehead pressed to the cold steel, drawing in a long breath that shook despite his effort to steady it. Then he pushed himself upright and returned to his station. The enemy ship was still there, damaged, burning, but stubbornly alive. Each exchange felt closer, more intimate, as if the fog had forced the two vessels into a narrow, unavoidable corridor of fate. Gunfire thundered again, the concussions punching through chests and ears. The Carmania answered, her guns roaring back, each blast echoing across the water like an accusation hurled into the void. Below decks, the wounded began to accumulate. A makeshift space had been cleared, though nothing about it resembled a hospital. Men lay on the deck or propped against bulkheads, faces pale, eyes glassy. One clutched his arm where blood soaked through hastily wrapped cloth. Another stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently, replaying moments only he could see. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp sting of disinfectant poured too quickly, too generously. A young sailor knelt beside a wounded friend, holding his hand. The injured man's grip tightened suddenly, nails biting into flesh. Did we stop them?" he whispered, breath rattling in his chest. The sailor swallowed hard. "We're still here," he said. It was the only truth he could offer. Above, a shell screamed past and exploded against the water, sending a column of spray high into the air. Droplets rained down like cold needles. The deck shuddered. Somewhere forward, a fire flared, licking hungrily at torn insulation before a crew rushed in to beat it down with soaked cloths and bare hands. The heat scorched their skin, they barely noticed. On the bridge, officers scanned the fog through binoculars, eyes burning, vision blurred. Every shadow looked like the enemy. Every lull felt temporary, fragile. The ship's engines continued their relentless rhythm, a mechanical pulse that felt almost defiant now, a refusal to slow, to yield, to die quietly. Then, gradually, the firing began to fade. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Just a subtle thinning, longer gaps between explosions, fewer flashes tearing through the fog. The Carmania's guns fell silent one by one, crews waiting for orders that did not immediately come. The sea filled the sudden space with its own sound, waves slapping steel, wind sighing through rigging, the distant hiss of steam. The enemy ship drifted back into the haze, its shape dissolving until it was nothing more than memory. Whether it was retreat or simple disappearance, no one could say for certain. No cheer rose from the deck. No sense of victory took hold. Only a heavy, uncertain quiet. Men looked around at one another, faces streaked with soot and sweat, eyes searching for meaning in the aftermath. They had survived, for now. But survival felt thin, provisional, like a breath held too long. The Carmania limped onward, wounded but afloat. Fires smoldered. The injured groaned softly below. The ship's hull creaked as it adjusted to the strain it had endured. Every sound carried weight now, as if anything might be the beginning of another catastrophe. A sailor gazed out into the fog where the enemy had vanished. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass, older somehow than it had been that morning. He rubbed his hands together, trying to chase away a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The battle was over. But the cost had only begun to reveal itself. War had reached inside the Carmania and left its mark, not just on steel and timber, but on the men who would carry this night with them long after the sea forgot the sound of guns. And as the fog closed in once more, the ship steamed forward into uncertainty, unaware that the hardest part of this story was still waiting. Chapter 2, Fire, Confusion, and the Cost of Survival. Morning did not arrive with light. It crept in quietly, diluted by fog and smoke, revealing the Carmania as she truly was now, scarred, exhausted, altered beyond recognition. The sea lay restless and grey around her, rippling gently as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. That indifference felt cruel. The ocean had witnessed everything, and yet it offered no acknowledgement, no pause for grief. Men moved through the wreckage with a cautious reverence, stepping around splintered wood and twisted metal. The deck bore the marks of violence, gouges where shells had struck, blackened patches where fire had been beaten down, dark stains that no amount of seawater could wash away. The air smelled of damp smoke and burned steel, a scent that clung stubbornly to lungs and memory alike. Below decks, the wounded stirred as the ship settled into a fragile calm. Some slept fitfully, bodies twitching with dreams they would not remember kindly. Others lay awake, staring into nothing, listening to the steady thrum of engines that felt suddenly too loud in the quiet aftermath. A medic knelt beside a man with a bandaged leg, tightening cloth with gentle hands. The wounded sailor hissed softly, then nodded, permission given without words. Pain had become expected now. In the narrow corridors, voices dropped instinctively. Men spoke in murmurs, as though raising their voices might summon the enemy back out of the fog. Someone asked for water. Someone else asked for a name, uncertain whether the man beside him was alive or only resting. When answers came, they were brief. When they didn't, silence settled like a weight. Captain and officers moved between compartments, taking stock of damage and men alike. Their faces were drawn, eyes rimmed with red from smoke and sleeplessness. Reports came in slowly, unevenly. Guns damaged but functional. Fires contained. Hull compromised in places, but holding, for now. Each piece of information carried relief and dread in equal measure. On the upper deck, a sailor leaned against the rail, staring out at the fog. His hands shook as he rolled a cigarette, fingers clumsy despite years of habit. He lit it, drew in smoke, then coughed violently, the sound scraping his throat raw. He laughed once, quietly, at himself. The sound felt wrong in the open air. Another man joined him, saying nothing. They stood side by side, watching the sea move beneath a sky that offered no comfort. After a while, one of them spoke. "I thought I was ready," he said, voice flat. "Turns out I wasn't." The other nodded. There was nothing to add. As the hours passed, exhaustion deepened. Muscles stiffened. Bruises bloomed dark beneath torn uniforms. The adrenaline that had carried them through the battle drained away, leaving behind a hollow ache. Men found places to sit, on coils of rope, on steps, on the deck itself, and closed their eyes, even as the ship continued onward. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by the echo of explosions and the flash of guns through fog. The Carmania steamed forward, slower now, careful. Every vibration felt amplified. Every unfamiliar sound drew glances, hands drifting unconsciously toward railings or weapons. Trust, in the ship, in the sea, in the idea of safety, had been damaged along with the hull. Below, a wounded sailor woke suddenly, gasping, eyes wild. He reached out, grasping at air. Another man was there instantly, pressing a hand to his shoulder, murmuring steady reassurances until the panic ebbed. The wounded man swallowed hard, ashamed, then nodded his thanks. No one spoke of it again. This was the cost that did not appear in reports. The cost measured in trembling hands, in voices that hesitated before speaking, in the way eyes flinched at sudden noise. The battle had ended, but it had left something unfinished behind it, an unease that clung as tightly as smoke. As the fog thinned slightly, revealing open water ahead, the men of the Carmania understood something without saying it aloud. Survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of what they would have to live with. By midday, the fog began to loosen its grip, thinning into ragged veils that revealed stretches of gray sea. Sunlight filtered through in pale bands, touching the Carmania without warmth, without comfort. The ship looked older in the light, every scar more visible, every bent railing a reminder of how close she had come to breaking apart. Men squinted against the brightness, blinking as if waking from a long, violent dream. Work resumed with a quiet urgency. Damage control teams moved methodically, their movements precise but weary. Steel plates were inspected, seams checked, leaks marked and shored. Hammers rang out in dull, echoing beats that traveled through the hull like a pulse. Each strike was measured, careful, no one wanted to stress the ship further. The smell of oil lingered everywhere, thick and persistent, mixing with the tang of seawater and burned paint. Below decks, the wounded were shifted and reassessed. A man with his arm bound tightly winced as he was helped upright, teeth clenched, breath hissing between them. Another stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, flexing fingers slowly, confirming they still belonged to him. A medic murmured instructions, voice calm, practiced, as he cleaned a wound that refused to stop bleeding. The cloth turned dark almost instantly. In a cramped corner near the forward compartments, two sailors sat shoulder to shoulder on an overturned crate. Neither spoke. One kept rubbing his palms against his trousers, over and over, as if trying to scrub away something invisible. The other watched him, then gently placed a hand over the restless motion. The gesture was small, almost awkward, but it worked. The hand stilled. Up on deck, an officer gathered a small group to account for the missing. Names were spoken aloud, each one landing heavily in the quiet air. Some were answered with a soft, "Here." Others were met with nothing at all. When the list ended, no one rushed to fill the silence. It stretched, fragile and raw, until the officer cleared his throat and dismissed the men. The sea rolled on, indifferent. A lookout called down from his post, not in alarm, but to report open water ahead. The sound of his voice carried farther than expected, clear and human against the vastness. For a moment, something like relief stirred. The sense of immediate danger had passed. The guns were quiet. The enemy was gone. And yet, no one celebrated. Men leaned on rails, gazing out across the water, lost in thoughts they did not yet have words for. Some replayed moments from the fight in relentless loops, the flash of a gun, the scream of metal, the sight of a man falling. Others felt only a numb heaviness, a dull ache where adrenaline had once burned hot. The body remembered even when the mind tried to move on. A sailor stood alone near the stern, fingers tracing a scorch mark along the railing. He remembered leaning there only hours before, heart pounding, convinced he would not see another sunrise. Now the mark was cool beneath his touch, just another scar among many. He wondered if anyone back home would ever understand what that mark meant. In the mess area, food was served, simple, unremarkable, but few had much appetite. Men picked at bread, sipped tea that tasted faintly of smoke. Conversation was subdued, drifting toward safer topics and then falling silent again. Someone mentioned the weather. Someone else nodded, grateful for something ordinary to acknowledge. As afternoon deepened, fatigue settled in fully. Shoulders slumped. Movements slowed. The ship's engines continued their steady rhythm, a constant reminder that forward motion was still possible, that they were still afloat. That sound, more than anything, grounded them. Captain and officers met briefly, conferring in low tones. Decisions were made about course and speed, about repairs and rest. The ship would continue on. There was no turning back now, no place for lingering. The world expected the Carmania to return as if nothing had happened, to fold this night into a report, a paragraph, a footnote. But among the crew, the truth lingered unspoken, something fundamental had shifted. They had crossed an invisible line, from preparation into reality, from expectation into consequence. The war was no longer an abstract idea carried in orders and headlines. It had weight. It had faces. As evening approached, the light softened, stretching long shadows across the deck. The fog stayed away, replaced by a clearer sky that felt almost intrusive. Men watched the sun sink toward the horizon, its reflection trembling across the water. It was beautiful. That, too, felt wrong. Night would come again. And with it, memory. The Carmania pressed on through the fading light, carrying not just her crew and her scars, but the quiet knowledge that survival had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Night returned with a different weight than before. It no longer arrived as a threat waiting beyond the fog, but as a quiet reckoning. The sky darkened gradually, stars appearing one by one above a sea that had resumed its endless, indifferent rhythm. The Carmania cut through the water steadily, her engines humming with a restrained resolve, as though even the machinery had learned caution. Lanterns were lit along the deck, their soft glow settling into familiar corners. The light felt smaller now. More fragile. Shadows stretched and clung to bulkheads, gathering where damage had been repaired but not forgotten. Men moved more slowly, their steps careful, almost reverent, as if the ship itself were something wounded that needed gentler handling. Below decks, sleep came unevenly. Some men collapsed into exhausted stillness, bodies surrendering at last. Others lay awake, staring at low ceilings, listening to the creak of steel and the slap of water against the hull. Every unfamiliar sound tugged at them, sharp and insistent. A sudden hiss of steam drew someone upright in panic before they realized it was only a valve adjusting. Embarrassed breaths followed. No one laughed. In one compartment, a sailor sat on the edge of his bunk, holding a photograph between his fingers. The edges were bent, the surface smudged with soot. He traced the outline of a face he loved, memorizing it again in the lantern light. Around him, the ship breathed, slow, measured, alive. He folded the photograph carefully and slipped it back into his pocket, pressing it flat against his chest as if anchoring himself to something solid. On deck, a small group gathered near the rail, drawn by the quiet rather than conversation. They stood shoulder to shoulder, gazing out at the dark water. The sea reflected starlight in broken fragments, impossible to hold in one place. Someone exhaled slowly. Someone else shifted their weight, boots scraping softly. "I keep thinking I hear it," one man said after a while. His voice was low, uncertain. "Hear what?" "The guns." No one answered immediately. Then another man nodded. "Me too." They fell silent again. There was nothing to add. The officers made their rounds, checking on posts, on men, on the quiet integrity of the ship. Reports were brief. Everything was holding. For now. The phrase repeated itself like a charm no one fully trusted. As the night deepened, the sea grew calmer, its surface smoothing into a dark, rolling plain. The Carmania moved through it with a subdued grace, her earlier violence giving way to something closer to fatigue. She carried her scars without complaint, her hull creaking softly as it adjusted to the strain. In the engine room, the heat remained intense. Sweat clung to skin despite the cool air above. The rhythm of pistons and gears was hypnotic, steady enough to soothe. Men worked in silence, communicating through nods and gestures, conserving words. The ship needed them awake. Present. Reliable. Above, a sailor leaned against a bulkhead and closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The vibration of the ship traveled through his back, grounding him. When he opened his eyes again, he felt steadier, tethered to something real. Near midnight, the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the clean scent of open water. The smell of smoke had faded at last, replaced by salt and cold. It felt like a small mercy. Captain and officers paused briefly on the bridge, looking out across the dark expanse ahead. There were no lights on the horizon. No movement. Just the vastness of the sea and the quiet assurance of forward motion. Whatever came next would come. Tonight, at least, they would hold. The Carmania pressed on through the darkness, carrying with her the invisible weight of what had been lost and what had been endured. The battle had taken hours. Its aftermath would last far longer. As the ship moved steadily toward another dawn, the men aboard understood something without speaking it aloud. They would never hear silence the same way again. Chapter 3, Aftermath, Silence, and a Fading Legacy. The days that followed blurred into one another, stitched together by routine and restraint. The Carmania sailed on, no longer hunting, just moving, steadily, deliberately, as if distance alone could soften what had already been carved into her steel and into the men who served her. The sea changed color with the hours, sometimes slate gray, sometimes pale and glassy, but it never offered commentary. It simply carried them forward. Repairs continued in quiet diligence. Bent railings were reinforced. Scorched plating was scrubbed clean where possible, though some marks refused to fade. Men worked without complaint, their movements efficient, almost automatic. The urgency had passed, but something sharper remained underneath, a need to restore order, to make the ship feel whole again, even if they knew she never truly would be. Below decks, the wounded healed slowly. Bandages were changed. Fevers watched carefully. A man who had not spoken since the battle finally asked for water, his voice hoarse and tentative, as if unsure he was allowed to take up space again. When a mug was placed in his hands, he nodded once in thanks, eyes glistening not with pain but with relief. He drank carefully, savoring each swallow. Others carried wounds that could not be dressed. One sailor flinched every time a door slammed. Another woke from sleep with a sharp intake of breath, heart racing, eyes wide in the dark. They did not speak of it. No one asked them to. The unspoken agreement was simple: survive first, understand later. The ship's log filled with tidy entries, coordinates, speeds, weather conditions. The language was clean and controlled, stripped of fear and confusion. There was no place in those lines for the sound of metal tearing, for the way smoke burned the lungs, for the look on a man's face when he realized he might not make it home. History would read the log and see order. The truth lived elsewhere. As land eventually drew nearer, anticipation should have grown. Instead, unease settled in. The thought of returning, to harbors, to normalcy, to people who had not heard the guns, felt strangely distant. Some men wondered how they would explain the weight they carried. Others suspected they never would. One evening, a sailor stood at the rail watching seabirds circle in the distance, their cries sharp and ordinary. He remembered watching birds like this on voyages before the war, when they had meant proximity to land, to warmth, to rest. Now they felt almost intrusive, reminders that the world beyond the ship had continued without pause. When the coastline finally appeared, low and indistinct against the horizon, there was no cheer. Men gathered silently, gazing toward it with expressions that hovered between longing and hesitation. Home was no longer a simple idea. It was a place filled with questions they did not yet know how to answer. The Carmania entered port without ceremony. Dockhands moved to receive her, unaware at first of the night she carried within her hull. From a distance, she looked serviceable. Scarred, yes, but afloat, functional. Only up close did the damage reveal itself: patched metal, darkened seams, the subtle sag of a ship that had been pushed hard and survived by margins too thin to name. Men disembarked in small groups. Some paused at the gangway, turning back for one last look at the deck where they had stood amid smoke and fear. A few touched the rail absently, fingers brushing the cool steel as if committing it to memory. Others walked on without looking back at all. News of the engagement spread quickly, but not deeply. Headlines reduced it to strategy and outcome. A brief encounter. A successful defense. Damage sustained. Casualties minimal. Words that sat neatly on a page, unable to convey the cost of trembling hands or sleepless nights. The Carmania would sail again. Her name would appear in records, then recede. New ships, new battles, new losses would demand attention. The men who had stood on her decks that night would disperse, some to other vessels, some back to civilian lives forever altered. And slowly, quietly, the memory of what happened would begin to fade. Not because it mattered less, but because silence has a way of settling in where stories are not told. In the weeks that followed, the Carmania became a footnote moving steadily toward obscurity. Repairs were logged, commendations discussed, procedures reviewed. The machinery of war absorbed the incident efficiently, breaking it down into conclusions and lessons learned. On paper, everything made sense. At sea, nothing ever truly did. The crew scattered. Some were reassigned almost immediately, stepping onto new decks that smelled unfamiliar, their boots echoing in corridors where no one knew what they had seen. Others were granted leave and returned home carrying stories they could not shape into sentences. Families noticed the change first, the way conversations stalled, the way eyes drifted toward windows when the house grew quiet, the way sleep became shallow and easily broken. A sailor sat at a kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, listening to his mother speak about ordinary things. Weather. Neighbors. News from down the road. He nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected. But beneath the rhythm of her voice, he heard something else, the thunder of guns, the hiss of steam, the deep groan of a ship under strain. When a plate clattered accidentally to the floor, he flinched hard enough to spill his drink. No one said anything. The silence was kind, but it cut all the same. Others tried to speak and found the words inadequate. How do you explain the smell of burned metal? The way fog can erase distance until danger feels intimate. The precise sound a shell makes when it tears into steel. They learned quickly that listeners wanted endings, clear victories, clean survival. The truth resisted that shape. Back at sea, the Carmania sailed on under new orders, her scars slowly blending into the wear of service. Fresh paint dulled the worst of the marks. Replaced plating shone briefly, then weathered. To unfamiliar eyes, she became just another armed cruiser, functional, unremarkable. But for those who had been there, the ship remained layered with ghosts. A man assigned to her months later would pause near a bulkhead without knowing why. Another would sense unease at a particular corner of the deck, unaware that someone had fallen there, that blood had once darkened the planks. Ships remember even when records do not. They carry impressions in steel and rivet, in the way they creak under pressure. Official histories mentioned the engagement briefly. Dates. Coordinates. Names of vessels involved. A paragraph, sometimes less. The emphasis lay on outcome, not experience. On strategy, not fear. On success, not cost. With each retelling, the edges smoothed further, until the event became something distant and abstract. Time did the rest. Years passed. New conflicts claimed attention. New ships took the spotlight. The men who had fought aboard the Carmania aged, some quietly, some with difficulty. A few kept journals, scribbling fragments late at night, sensations rather than narratives. The vibration of the deck. The color of the sea under firelight. The way silence felt afterward. Others burned their notes, unwilling to preserve what they wanted desperately to forget. Occasionally, at reunions or chance encounters, the subject surfaced. A glance exchanged. A half-finished sentence. A nod heavy with shared understanding. They did not need to explain. Memory filled the gaps effortlessly. The Carmania herself would not survive forever. Like all ships, she was bound to time and tide. Eventually, she would be scrapped, her steel cut apart and repurposed, her name removed from active lists. No ceremony would mark the end of her service. No crowd would gather to mourn the passing of a vessel that history had already set aside. And yet, something remained. In the quiet moments, when fog rolled in unexpectedly, when the sea lay too calm, when a sudden sound echoed too sharply, those who had been there felt it return. Not as terror, but as presence. A reminder that they had stood at the edge of something immense and survived by chance as much as courage. The tragedy of the Carmania was not that she was forgotten. It was that forgetting came so easily. And that only a few still carried the weight of what it meant to remember. Years later, the sea would look the same. That was perhaps the cruelest truth of all. The Atlantic continued its endless motion, gray and indifferent, rising and falling beneath skies that forgot names as easily as they formed clouds. Ships crossed the same waters where the Carmania had fought for her life, their wakes cutting clean lines through history without pause or awareness. No marker floated there. No monument rose from the waves. Only water, restless, patient, unburdened by memory. For those who survived, remembrance arrived without invitation. A certain quality of fog could still tighten the chest. The smell of hot oil could still pull the mind backward, instant and merciless. Some men avoided the sea altogether after the war, choosing land and silence over the risk of hearing echoes they could not outrun. Others returned again and again, drawn by something they did not fully understand, a need to face the same horizon and prove, quietly, that it no longer held power over them. But the past was not so easily dismissed. One former sailor, now gray-haired, stood at a harbor rail decades later, watching a liner depart. The ship's engines rumbled softly, controlled, confident. Passengers waved from the deck, laughter drifting faintly across the water. For a moment, he saw another ship overlaid atop it, smoke-stained, shaking under gunfire, men braced against steel as the world came apart around them. He blinked, and the image dissolved. The harbor remained. The present reasserted itself. He rested his hands on the rail until the tremor passed. History, when it remembered the Carmania at all, did so briefly. A line in a book. A paragraph in a registry. A mention among many engagements, none deemed decisive enough to linger on. There were no famous last stands, no dramatic sinking to command attention. The ship had survived, and in surviving, she had slipped quietly out of the stories people preferred to tell. Yet survival was never simple. The men who had served aboard her carried the night forward in pieces, in the way they paused before sleeping, in the instinctive scan of exits in crowded rooms, in the reflexive flinch at sudden noise. They carried it in the spaces between words, in conversations that drifted away from war before they reached anything real. And when they died, one by one, years apart, their memories often went with them. Families sorted through belongings, finding medals without context, photographs without explanation, letters that hinted at something vast but never named it. The details slipped away, unanchored. This is how tragedies fade, not with intention, but with time. The Carmania herself became steel again. Cut, melted, reshaped into structures that would never know what they had once endured. Her decks, her bulkheads, the places where men had stood gripping rails in smoke and fear, all reduced to material, anonymous and silent. But stories do not vanish completely. They wait. They linger in archives, in half-remembered accounts, in the quiet unease that sometimes settles when reading a name too quickly dismissed. They surface when someone pauses long enough to ask not just what happened, but what it felt like. What it felt like to stand on a ship never meant for war. To smell smoke where perfume once lingered. To hear metal scream and wonder if the sea would take everything you were before the sun rose again. The tragedy of the HMS Carmania was not a single night of fire and fog. It was the slow erasure that followed. And the knowledge that unless someone listens, truly listens, the sea will keep what it took, and history will keep moving, unaware of the lives it stepped over in silence. Tonight, somewhere far from any coast, the Atlantic breathes steadily. And beneath that surface, memory waits.